A dog? You have one final request on this earth, before you answer for your crimes against our sovereignty, and you ask for a pet. The commander's voice, a coarse bellow accustomed to being obeyed, ricocheted off the damp stone walls of the makeshift interrogation cell. The crowd of armed men surrounding him, a motley collection of militia fighters clad in mismatched gear, erupted in a wave of derisive laughter. The sound was ugly, a chorus of contempt that filled the cold, cramped space. But the woman, shackled to a steel chair in the center of the room, offered no reaction. Her head did not bow, her eyes did not flinch. She simply sat in a state of profound and unnerving calm, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond her captors, a portrait of stillness amidst the cacophony of their scorn. The senior officer observing from the shadows, a man whose face was a roadmap of forgotten wars, saw not weakness in her silence, but a discipline so absolute it bordered on the sublime. He saw the subtle tension in her shoulders, the controlled rhythm of her breathing, and he felt a cold premonition that they had all made a catastrophic error in judgment. If you believe that true strength is found not in the volume of the threat, but in the certainty of the action, type competence below. The fortress was carved into the spine of a mountain range that scraped against the belly of a perpetually gray sky, a jagged scar of granite and ice known to the locals only as the Needle. It was a place that had rejected civilization, a remote bastion of defiance, accessible only by a single treacherous road or the daring descent of a helicopter. Inside its walls, the air was thin and frigid, carrying the metallic scent of cordite, stale sweat, and the slow, inexorable decay of concrete. This was the domain of a warlord named Kale, a man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty. He styled himself a revolutionary, but he was little more than a brigand with a private army, and this cell, deep in the fortress's gut, was his personal theater of intimidation. The woman, designated prisoner 734, had been here for 3 days. They believed her to be a low-level communications analyst, a soft target scooped up during a border skirmish, valuable only for whatever tactical frequencies she might surrender under duress. Her appearance did nothing to dissuade them of this assumption. She was of average height and build, her face smudged with dirt and shadowed by a blossoming bruise on her cheekbone. Her uniform had been stripped away, replaced by a drab, gray jumpsuit that hung loosely on her frame. She looked, to all intents and purposes, like a clerk, a non-combatant, a piece of administrative machinery caught in the gears of a war she was never meant to fight. Kale circled her now like a carrion bird, his polished boots clicking a sharp, arrogant rhythm on the stained floor. He was a man who performed his authority, who wore his rank like a costume. His uniform was too clean, his beard too meticulously trimmed for this desolate outpost. He was playing a role, and he needed an audience. "Look at her, men," he sneered, gesturing expansively with a gloved hand. "The mighty Western intelligence apparatus sends us their best and brightest. And what does she do when faced with the final curtain? She cries for her puppy. Is this the warrior spirit they boast of? This sentimental, weak female fragility?" He spat the word female as if it were an epithet, a conclusive piece of evidence in his argument of superiority. His men chuckled their agreement, their faces a mixture of sycophantic amusement and casual brutality. They saw what their commander told them to see: a broken woman, a pathetic creature whose final thoughts were of some pampered pet. They did not see the calluses on her palms, worn smooth not by a keyboard but by the checkered grip of a rifle stock. They did not notice that her wrists, though chafed raw by the tight zip ties, showed no signs of struggle, because she had been conserving energy, testing the tensile strength with minute, almost imperceptible movements for the last 72 hours. They did not understand the nature of her gaze, which wasn't vacant, but was instead scanning, mapping, and recording every detail of the room. The number of guards, the types of their weapons, the location of the exits, the subtle shift in the weight of the man standing nearest the door. Her mind was not on her fate. It was on the problem set laid out before her. Her silence was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of a professional at work. Her request was not a plea for comfort. It was a tactical imperative. Cale savored the moment, basking in the perceived validation of his worldview. His entire command philosophy was built upon a foundation of loud, theatrical dominance. He believed strength was a performance, a projection of unassailable confidence that cowed lesser men and, in his estimation, all women. He saw her quiet stillness not as composure, but as a catatonic state of terror, a mind shattered by the prospect of its imminent demise. This request for a dog was the perfect, final confirmation of his prejudice. It was a gift, an opportunity to demonstrate to his soldiers the fundamental weakness of their enemy. He would grant it, of course. The act of magnanimity, of granting the absurd and sentimental final wish of a condemned prisoner, would only serve to amplify his own power. It was a gesture of ultimate contempt, the final twist of the knife before the inevitable end. "You know," he began, leaning in close so that she could smell the acrid coffee on his breath, "I am a reasonable man. I believe even the condemned deserve a measure of pity." He straightened up, a smug, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "Very well. You shall see your dog. I want every man here to witness this. I want you all to see the final moments of a so-called intelligence officer. And I want you to remember that her last thought was of a flea-bitten mutt." He turned to his subordinate, a hulking man with a shaved head and a cruel, vacant expression. "Sergeant, go with 2 men to the holding area." They brought in her personal effects. The animal was with them. They said it was some kind of military breed, a Malinois, probably some glorified lapdog with a fancy name. "Bring the creature here. Let her have her tearful reunion." The sergeant grunted an affirmative, the corner of his mouth twitching in amusement. "A Malinois, sir? Maybe it'll perform a trick for us before we put them both down." The joke landed perfectly, and another ripple of coarse laughter washed through the room. Cale clapped the sergeant on the shoulder. "Excellent. Perhaps it can roll over. It seems its owner has already mastered playing dead." As the sergeant and his detail departed, the atmosphere in the cell shifted from active menace to a kind of voyeuristic anticipation. The remaining soldiers relaxed their stances, leaning against the walls, their weapons held loosely. The threat, in their minds, had been completely neutralized. They were no longer guards. They were spectators at a sad, pathetic circus. The woman remained motionless in the chair. The narrator of this scene, were there one, would not describe her as a prisoner waiting for a pet. They would describe her as a hunter waiting for the bait to be laid. Her mind was a cold, clear engine of calculation. The request had been a gamble, a single play in a game where the stakes were absolute. She knew that in their arrogance, they would see sentimentality where there was strategy. They would hear dog and picture a furry companion. They could not conceive of what was actually coming. She had spent years, thousands of hours, forging a bond that transcended the simple dynamic of owner and pet. It was a partnership, a symbiotic relationship built on a silent language of command and response, of shared instinct and absolute trust. The being they were bringing into this room was not an animal in the conventional sense. It was a weapon system, a living, breathing extension of her own will, and it was the key to changing the entire equation of her captivity. Her breathing remained slow and even a metronome counting down the seconds. In out, a physiological discipline that kept her heart rate low, her mind sharp, her muscles ready. She filtered out the lingering echoes of their laughter, the smell of the damp stone, the oppressive weight of their ignorance. She focused on a single point of convergence in the near future, the moment the door would open again, the moment her partner would enter the room. And in that razor-thin slice of time, everything would change. They thought they were granting a last wish. In reality, they were signing their own writ of surrender. They just didn't know it yet. The wait stretched into several long, tense minutes, a silence punctuated only by the shuffling of boots and the occasional cough. Cale had taken up a position near the center of the room, arms crossed, radiating an air of smug impatience. He intended to draw out this little drama, to let the anticipation build before the final, pathetic punchline. For the woman, whose name was Anya. These were not empty minutes. They were the final moments of preparation. Her mind moved with a speed and clarity that would have terrified her captors had they been able to witness it. She re-verified her mental map of the room. 7 men remaining, including Kale. 5 armed with standard AK pattern rifles. 1 with a sidearm, Kale himself. The man nearest the door, a thick-set brute with a nervous tick, had his rifle slung carelessly over his shoulder. The man to her immediate left had his hand resting on the grip of his pistol, a sign of either readiness or laziness. She cataloged their postures, their lines of sight, their expressions of bored superiority. They were complacent, they were sloppy, and they were about to pay the price for it. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor, growing louder, accompanied by the dry, rhythmic click of claws on concrete. A low whine cut through the air. Kale's smirk widened. Ah, the guest of honor arrives. Prepare for the waterworks. Men, the heavy steel door groaned open, and the sergeant shoved the dog into the room. It was a Belgian Malinois, just as the manifest had stated. But it was not the pampered show dog Kale had imagined. This was a creature of pure, condensed energy. It was lean, but every inch of it was corded with muscle, its fawn-colored coat stretched tight over a frame built for speed and power. Its ears were erect and alert, its dark eyes intelligent and unervingly focused. It wore a specialized harness, a complex assembly of nylon webbing and matte black hardware that the guards had dismissed as an expensive pet accessory. They failed to see the reinforced D-ring for fast roping, the integrated maul webbing for attaching equipment, or the small, protected housing for a tactical camera near the animal's withers. The dog, whose name was Ghost, did not bark or growl. It stood just inside the doorway, its head low, surveying the room with an unnerving intensity. Its gaze swept over the armed man, lingered for a fraction of a second on Kale, and then locked onto Anya. In that instant, a silent conversation took place, an exchange of information that no one else in the room could comprehend. The dog's tail gave a single, almost imperceptible flick. It was not a wag of happiness. It was an acknowledgement. Ready, Anya's eyes softened for the briefest of moments, the only crack in her stoic facade. "Stand by," the guards laughed. "Look at that thing," one of them muttered. All geared up to go for a walk, Kale stepped forward. "Well, prisoner 734, there he is. Your loyal companion. You have 2 minutes to say your goodbyes. Make them count." Anya ignored him completely. Her focus was entirely on the dog. She watched as Ghost took a few deliberate steps forward, his movements fluid and silent, a predator entering a new territory. He stopped precisely 5 feet in front of her chair, a trained distance, and sat, his body coiled like a spring. To the guards, it looked like a simple act of obedience. To Anya, it was the final confirmation of their shared language. She began to speak, her voice low and calm, not the choked whisper of a condemned woman, but the clear, measured tone of a handler issuing commands. "Hey, buddy," she said in English, her voice a soft murmur. It was a disarming, seemingly sentimental phrase. But as she spoke, her hands, still bound in front of her, moved in a series of tiny, complex gestures. A twitch of finger, a slight rotation of the wrist. It was a secondary language, a manual shorthand they had practiced 1,000 times. Under the cover of stroking the dog's head, she was performing a systems check. Her fingers brushed against the harness, feeling for the small, hardened data drive tucked into a hidden pocket. She felt the reassuring click of the magnetic clasp on a pouch containing a universal cuff key. All in place. Already, her hand moved to the dog's collar, her thumb pressing a small, recessed button twice. A tiny LED, invisible to anyone not looking for it, blinked green. The tactical camera was active and transmitting. Kale watched, his amusement beginning to curdle into annoyance. Enough of this touching reunion. Your time is up. That was his final mistake. Anya's eyes lifted from the dog and met Kale's. For the first time since her capture, he saw something in her gaze. It wasn't fear. It wasn't despair. It was an abyss, a chilling void of professional focus that promised nothing but swift and total violence. "Das Kommando ist Falke, je visperet, hier voicebarely audible. It was a single phrase in German, the release word. It meant falcon. Before the final syllable had faded, the room erupted into a symphony of chaos, orchestrated by a silent conductor and her perfectly tuned instrument. Ghost exploded from his seated position. He was not a dog anymore. He was a fawn-colored blur, a projectile of focused fury. He did not go for Kale. He went for the nearest and most immediate threat, the guard to Anya's left, the one with his hand on his pistol. The dog launched himself into the air, his jaws closing not on flesh, but on the man's weapon hand. The sound of crunching bone was sickeningly loud in the small room, followed by a high-pitched scream of agony as the guard's pistol clattered to the floor. Simultaneously, as every eye was drawn to the first violent act, Anya moved. The hours of minute, patient work on her restraints paid off. With a single violent flex of her shoulders and wrists, she snapped the pre-weakened zip tie. The movement was so fast, so economical, it was almost missed. In the same fluid motion, she lunged forward, snatching the fallen pistol from the floor. She didn't rise from the chair. She used it as a stable firing platform, a pivot point. The first shot was a deafening crack, a double tap to the chest of the guard nearest the door, the one with the slung rifle. He was down before he even understood what was happening, his body slumping against the steel frame, effectively blocking it. The room, which moments before had been filled with arrogant laughter, was now a maelstrom of shock and violence. Ghost, having neutralized the first guard, was already moving to the next. He wasn't a wild animal. His attack was precise, tactical. He hit the second guard low, at the knees, taking him out of the fight without presenting a large target. Anya was the eye of the storm. While chaos reigned around her, she was a point of absolute calm and lethal efficiency. She acquired her next target, the man who had been laughing the loudest. Another 2 shots, perfectly placed. He crumpled to the ground. For seconds had passed. 4 men were down. The remaining guards were fumbling, their minds struggling to process the instantaneous shift from absolute control to total pandemonium. They were raising their rifles, but they were slow, clumsy, their movements born of panic, not training. Ghost was a phantom, weaving between them, a disruptive force that shattered their cohesion and drew their fire. Anya used the dog's movement as a shield, a distraction. She fired again, and another guard fell. Now it was just Kale and 1 remaining soldier. The soldier, his face pale with terror, finally managed to bring his rifle to bear on Anya. But before he could pull the trigger, Ghost, in a breathtaking display of agility, leaped onto a nearby table and launched himself at the man's throat. The attack was final. Kale stood frozen, his hand hovering over the sidearm he had failed to draw. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated disbelief. The world he had constructed, a world built on his own perceived strength and the weakness of others, had been demolished in less than 10 seconds. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the coppery tang of fear. The room was suddenly, deafeningly silent, the echoes of the gunshots fading into the groans of the wounded. Anya rose from the chair, the captured pistol held steady in a perfect 2-handed grip, its muzzle pointed directly at Kale's chest. Ghost trotted to her side, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his eyes fixed on the last man standing. The pathetic circus was over. The real show had just begun. The silence that descended upon the cell was heavier and more terrifying than the preceding violence. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of laughter and arrogant pronouncements, a vacuum where Kale's authority had once existed. He stared at Anya, his mind refusing to accept the reality of the scene before him. His elite guards were either unconscious or writhing on the floor, neutralized with a terrifying economy of motion. The woman he had mocked, the weak, sentimental analyst, now stood before him as the absolute master of the room. She held the pistol with a familiarity that spoke of thousands of hours on the range, her stance balanced, her grip unwavering. The dog at her side was no pet. It was a silent, watchful killer, its body tensed, awaiting the next command. Kale's bravado, the very core of his identity, had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man. "Oh, what are you?" he stammered, the words catching in his throat. Anya didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her transformation from captive to captor was the only answer required. Her eyes, cold and analytical, swept the room one final time, ensuring there were no remaining threats. Satisfied, she took a deliberate step toward Kale, the pistol never wavering from his center mass. The sound of running footsteps and shouted commands echoed from the corridor. The gunshots had alerted the rest of the fortress. In moments, the door would be swarmed. But Anya showed no sign of panic. She simply waited, a portrait of lethal patience. The blocked door was forced open with a heavy thud, and a dozen more soldiers flooded into the narrow entryway, their rifles raised, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. They stopped dead at the threshold, an impassable logjam of men, their forward momentum halted by the shocking tableau within. They saw their commander held at gunpoint by the female prisoner. They saw their comrades littering the floor. They saw the dog, a silent wolf, standing guard. But before anyone could make a rash move, a new voice cut through the tension, sharp and authoritative. "Stand down. All of you, hold your positions." The soldiers parted, and a man stepped through their ranks into the cell. He was older than Kale, his face weathered and severe, his uniform worn but impeccably maintained. He wore the insignia of the overall commander of the region, a man known simply as Valerius. He was a soldier from a different era, a man who understood that true power was not performed but possessed. Valerius's eyes took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. He did not see chaos. He saw the results of a brutally efficient action. He saw the precise, disabling shots. He saw the strategic use of the dog to create disruption. He saw the way Anya held her weapon, the way she controlled the space around her. He was not looking at a prisoner who had gotten lucky. He was looking at a professional operator. He ignored the whimpering Kale and the groaning men on the floor. His attention was fixed entirely on Anya and the dog. He noted the animal's harness, recognizing its tactical design immediately. He saw the subtle, almost invisible earpiece tucked into Anya's ear, its wire running down the collar of her jumpsuit, a piece of gear his men had completely missed during their cursory searches. He saw not a victim, but a peer. Valerius said, his voice calm, addressing Anya directly. It was not a question, but a command for identification. Identify yourself by designation, not by name or rank. His choice of words was specific, a piece of professional shorthand. He was speaking to her not as a captor, but as one soldier to another, acknowledging the rules of a game Kale had never even known he was playing. Anya's eyes met his. She recognized in him what she had not seen in Kale, the quiet competence of a true professional. There was no arrogance in his gaze, only a cold, hard assessment of the situation. Operator designation Echo 7, she replied, her voice steady and clear. Spectre Group, K. 9 Direct Action Unit. The designation hung in the air, dense with unspoken meaning. Spectre Group. To the common soldiers crammed in the doorway, the name meant nothing. But Valerius's expression tightened, a flicker of grim understanding crossing his features. He had heard whispers of that unit, rumors from the shadowy world of intelligence and special operations. They were a ghost unit, a Tier 1 asset that didn't officially exist, deployed only for the most critical and sensitive missions. They were spoken of in the same hushed, reverent tones as the world's most elite special forces. They were scalpels, not hammers, and they were rumored to be the best in the world at what they did. Kale, hearing the designation, could only stare blankly, his mind still reeling. The name was alien to him, a piece of a puzzle he couldn't comprehend. But Valerius understood. He understood the catastrophic failure of intelligence that had just unfolded in this cell. He slowly raised a hand, not in a threatening gesture, but to forestall any foolish action from his men. "Everyone, lower your weapons," he commanded, his voice low but carrying an unshakable weight of authority. The soldiers hesitated, their eyes darting between their commander and the armed woman. "Now," Valerius repeated, his tone sharpening, and reluctantly, the muzzles of their rifles dipped toward the floor. Valerius took a cautious step into the room, his eyes never leaving Anya. He gestured toward a ruggedized laptop sitting on a steel table in the corner, a piece of captured enemy equipment. My technicians have been trying to slice through the encryption on that device for a week, he said, his voice a low rumble. It was recovered from one of your forward observation posts. Anya gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The encryption is tied to biometric data. It requires an operator's thumbprint and a voice command. Valerius's eyes narrowed. And I suspect you are that operator. I am, she confirmed, her voice flat, devoid of any triumph. It was a simple statement of fact. This revelation was a tactical earthquake. The device they had dismissed as a useless brick was, in fact, a direct link into a high-level intelligence network, and she was the only key. Valerius walked over to the laptop, his movements deliberate. He looked back at Anya. The file for Echo 7. I want to see it. Anya kept her pistol trained on Kale, but she spoke a short, clear phrase in English. Ghost, watch him. The dog took a single step forward, positioning itself directly in front of Kale, and a low, menacing growl emanated from its chest. The message was unmistakable. Anya then walked to the laptop, never turning her back on the room. With one hand still holding the pistol, she placed the thumb of her other hand on the scanner. A green light blinked. Voice authentication, she said, her voice clear and measured. Authorization code, Sarah to November 734. The screen flickered to life, the layers of encryption melting away to reveal a stark, black and white interface. A search bar blinked expectantly. Valerius leaned closer, his expression grim. Search designation, Echo 7. Anya typed the query. A single file appeared. She opened it. The screen was filled with lines of text, a litany of a life lived in the shadows. Valerius began to read aloud, his voice a cold, hard monotone that cut through the silence of the room, each word a hammer blow against Kale's shattered ego. Unit, Joint Special Operations Command, Special Mission Unit, Spectre Group. Primary Specialty, K. 9 Human Canine Tracking and Apprehension. Secondary Specialty, High-Value Target Extraction, Covert Reconnaissance. He paused, taking a breath before continuing. Combat Deploiement, 18. All classified. Commendations. Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart. He fell silent, his eyes scanning a section of the file that was heavily redacted. Mission history, classified. Psychological profile, superior emotional regulation under extreme duress. Tactical assessment, exhibits unparalleled situational awareness and lethality. Considered the single most effective operator in the K-9 Direct Action Program. Valerius straightened up, his face a mask of cold fury. He turned his gaze slowly, deliberately, until it landed on Kale, who seemed to shrink under its weight. You had a ghost in your custody, Valerius said, his voice dripping with contempt. The most decorated operator in her field. And you wanted to see her dog do a trick? He then turned back to Anya, and in a gesture that stunned every man in the room, he gave a short, sharp nod of his head. It wasn't a salute, not quite. It was something more profound. It was a nonverbal acknowledgement of her status, a sign of respect from one professional warrior to another, a gesture that transcended the lines of their conflict. He was no longer looking at a prisoner. He was looking at his equal. The ripple effect of the revelation in the cell spread through the mountain fortress, not like wildfire, but like a seismic shockwave. The story was pieced together in hushed whispers in the mess hall, in fearful, sidelong glances exchanged on the parapets, in the sudden, sober silence that fell over any room Kale entered. The tale of Prisoner 734 became the story of the woman with the ghost dog, a cautionary legend passed between centuries during the long, cold nights. The narrative was simple and terrifying. They had held a phantom in their midst and, blinded by their own arrogance, had nearly provoked a catastrophe. The men who had laughed at her request now avoided her gaze, their mockery replaced by a primal, superstitious fear. They had witnessed a fundamental law of their universe be overturned. The quietest, most unassuming person in the room had proven to be, by an order of magnitude, the most dangerous. Cale was a broken man. Valerius had stripped him of his command in front of his own men. The public humiliation, a far deeper wound than any physical blow. He was reassigned to logistics, a paper-pushing job in the deepest, most forgotten corner of the fortress, a commander reduced to counting crates of ammunition. His authority, built on a scaffolding of bluster and intimidation, had collapsed under the weight of a single, undeniable demonstration of competence. He spent his days in a dusty office, haunted by the memory of Anya's cold, calm eyes, by the chilling efficiency of her movements, by the sound of his own laughter echoing back at him like an indictment. He was forced to confront the truth, that his prejudice, his deeply ingrained belief in her weakness, had been a tactical blind spot so vast it had nearly cost him everything. He had mistaken discipline for fear, silence for submission, and a request for a partner as a plea for a pet. It was a lesson in humility delivered at the muzzle of a gun. The dynamic of Anya's captivity was irrevocably altered. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a strategic asset. She was moved from the damp cell to a Spartan but clean officer's quarters, the door guarded not to keep her in, but to keep others out. Ghost was with her at all times, a constant, silent shadow at her side. Valerius began a new kind of negotiation, not of interrogation, but of diplomacy. He met with her daily, not as a captor speaking to a captive, but as one commander to another. They discussed terms, not for her surrender, but for a potential prisoner exchange, for a de-escalation of the conflict in the region. He recognized that the intelligence she possessed and the access she held made her infinitely more valuable alive and as a negotiating partner than as a corpse. During these meetings, he saw the truth of the file he had read. Her mind was sharp, her arguments logical, her demeanor unflappable. She never boasted. She never threatened. She simply stated facts, laid out options, and analyzed outcomes with a detached, professional clarity. She was, in every sense of the word, a quiet professional. For the first time, Cale saw what Valerius had recognized instantly. One afternoon, from the window of his miserable office, he saw Anya in the main training yard. Valerius had granted her permission to exercise her K-9 partner. Cale watched, mesmerized, as she and Ghost moved together in a silent, intricate dance. She would give a hand signal, a subtle gesture almost invisible from a distance, and the dog would respond instantly, dropping to the ground, weaving through obstacles, or freezing in place like a statue. There were no loud commands, no shouted encouragement. There was only a seamless, unspoken synergy, a perfect union of human intellect and animal instinct forged into a single, lethal entity. In that moment, watching the silent symphony of precision and trust, Cale finally, truly understood the depth of his foolishness. He had looked at one of the world's most elite warriors and had seen only her gender. He had looked at a highly trained tactical asset and had seen only a dog. His assumptions had been his prison, and now he was living in the one she had built for him. The legend grew, and with it, a new symbol emerged within the fortress. The guard began to refer to the interrogation cell not by its number, but as the kennel. The phrase, "Don't ask about her dog," became a common refrain, a grim piece of gallows humor that served as a potent reminder. Never underestimate your opponent, especially the one who says nothing at all. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in quiet diplomacy, conducted in a barren room deep within the mountain fortress. The negotiations between Valerius and Anya were tense and complex, a high-stakes chess match where the pieces were human lives and regional stability. Anya, with access to her communications gear, became a conduit to her own command. She was no longer a prisoner, but an envoy, a plenipotentiary operating behind enemy lines. She negotiated not for her own freedom, but for a broader settlement, a ceasefire, the establishment of a deconflicted zone, and a comprehensive exchange of all prisoners held by both sides. Valerius, for his part, proved to be a pragmatic, an honorable adversary. He recognized the opportunity Anya's presence represented, a chance to end a bloody, attritional conflict with a negotiated peace rather than a fight to the last man. He respected her professionalism, her refusal to be drawn into emotional arguments, her unwavering focus on the strategic objectives. He had seen the cost of underestimation firsthand, and he was determined not to make the same mistake twice. The story of what had happened in the kennel had cemented his authority. His men, having witnessed the swift and brutal downfall of the arrogant Kale, now followed Valerius with a renewed sense of loyalty, a loyalty born of respect for his wisdom and judgment. He had recognized the lion while Kale was still mocking the lamb, and that had earned him more credibility than a dozen battlefield victories. The day of the exchange arrived with the cold, gray light of dawn. A convoy of vehicles descended the winding mountain road to a prearranged meeting point in the valley below, a stark, windswept plain that served as a no-man's land. Anya stood beside Valerius as they watched the approaching helicopters of her own forces, dark specks growing against the horizon. Ghost sat patiently at her heel, his gaze fixed on the distance. There was no animosity between the two commanders, only a quiet, mutual respect. They had been on opposite sides of a war, but they understood each other, bound by a shared code of professionalism that transcended allegiance. "Your file said you were the best," Valerius said, his voice a low rumble against the wind. It was an understatement. Anya simply nodded, accepting the comment not as praise, but as an objective assessment. "You are a pragmatic leader, Commander," she replied. "You chose peace when a lesser man would have chosen pride." It was the highest compliment she could pay him. The exchange itself was executed with military precision. Prisoners were led out, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief. Names were checked against a manifest. As Anya prepared to board the waiting Black Hawk helicopter, she paused and turned back to Valerius. He met her gaze and gave her the same short, sharp nod he had given her in the cell. It was a final acknowledgement, a silent farewell from one warrior to another. Anya returned the gesture, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Then, with a quiet word to Ghost, she boarded the helicopter and, without a backward glance, vanished into the sky. Back at her unit's forward operating base, her return was quiet and unceremonious, just as she preferred. There was no grand celebration, only a thorough debriefing and a clean bill of health from the medics. But the story had preceded her. It had traveled through the encrypted channels and back-channel communications, spreading through the special operations community. The legend of Echo 7 and her partner, Ghost, became institutional folklore, a new chapter in the unit's already storied history. It became a teaching tool at the selection and training courses. Instructors would tell the story to new candidates, a stark and powerful lesson in the virtues of quiet competence. The moral was clear. Your reputation is not built on what you say you can do. It is built, brick by silent brick, on what you have already done. Arrogance is a liability. Assumptions are fatal, and you never, ever underestimate the quiet professional. The photo of Anya and Ghost, taken from the tactical camera feed during the first moments in the cell, was quietly pinned to a bulletin board in the Spectre Group briefing room. It showed a woman kneeling before her dog, a picture of calm purpose in a room full of oblivious, laughing men. Underneath it, someone had written a simple, two-word caption, "The Falcon." It was a tribute, a reminder, and a promise. The legacy of that day in the mountain fortress endured long after the ink on the peace treaty was dry. The ceasefire held, a fragile but persistent quiet settling over the war-torn valleys. Valerius, his position solidified, became a key figure in the region's new political landscape, a man known for his pragmatism and his uncanny ability to see beyond the surface of things. He never spoke of the incident in detail, but the lesson was seared into his command philosophy. He taught his new officers to value observation over assumption, to respect discipline in any form, and to understand that the most significant threats often announce themselves with silence. The kennel remained empty, a sealed and silent monument to the hubris that had nearly destroyed them. It served as a stark, physical reminder of the day their world was turned upside down by one woman and her dog. New recruits were shown the sealed door and told the story, ensuring the lesson of that day would be passed down to the next generation, a foundational myth for their reformed military culture. Kale, meanwhile, faded into obscurity, a forgotten man in a forgotten office, a living testament to the career-ending consequences of ignorant prejudice. His name became a cautionary tale, a synonym for an arrogant fool who mistook a loaded weapon for a harmless toy. He was the antagonist in a story that was no longer his, a story that would be told long after he was gone. Years later, Anya, now in a training and advisory role, stood before a class of new canine handlers. She was still unassuming, her voice still calm and measured, giving no outward sign of the legendary operator she was. Beside her sat Ghost, older now, his muzzle flecked with gray, but his eyes still carrying the same intelligent, watchful fire. She was teaching them about the bond, the silent language, the absolute trust that must exist between a handler and their partner. She didn't recount the specifics of her capture. She never did. She didn't need to. The core of the lesson was not in the dramatic details of combat, but in the quiet principles of her profession. Your greatest weapon is not the animal at your side, she told the young, eager faces watching her. It is not your rifle. It is not your training. Your greatest weapon is the space between your opponent's assumption and the reality of your competence. That space is where you live. It is where you fight, and it is where you will win. Be quiet. Be methodical. Be professional. Let your actions speak for you, because they will speak with a clarity and a finality that no boast ever can. She paused, letting the words settle in the quiet room. True strength was never loud. It didn't need to be. It was the steady hand, the calm heart, the mind that sees the whole board while others see only their next move. It was the courage to be underestimated, the discipline to wait for the perfect moment, and the skill to act with decisive, irrefutable force when that moment arrives. It was the understanding that respect is not a birthright or a privilege of rank. It is a currency earned in the hard coin of demonstrated ability. The legacy of Echo 7 was not a collection of medals in a display case or a list of redacted missions in a classified file. It was in the quiet confidence of the new generation of handlers she was training. It was in the enduring peace in a valley once ravaged by war. It was a living, breathing testament to a simple, profound truth, that in the end, the world is not shaped by the loudest voice in the room, but by the most competent hands. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over ignorant arrogance, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.